Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Victor Fett, along with our producer, Larry Sherray, and Dr. Katerina Shrey, our co-host. We host a weekly discussion panel on Russia's war in Ukraine with guests from Ukraine, military experts, academics, artists, literary figures, medical personnel, relief workers. Our panel is recorded and circulated nationally and internationally. We appreciate your comments and feedback. Special thanks to Marshall University Libraries and MUIT for making this weekly event possible. If you're joining us live on Teams, please feel free to use this chat to post questions for our guests. I'm glad to introduce today's wonderful speaker, Dr. Alla Nedashkivska from Canada, University of Alberta. She's a professor of Slavic linguistics and applied linguistics in the Department of Modern Languages and Cultural Studies. She has been teaching at the University of Alberta since 1999, and she will be talking on language activism or linguistic activism during the war in Ukraine. Please, Alla, the microphone is yours.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you, Victor. Thank you, colleagues, for the kind invitation to speak in this series. I'm very grateful and honored for the opportunity to contribute to such an important and ongoing conversation about Ukraine. I hope that my slides are showing correctly. So, I would like to start with a question that has been guiding one of my projects. What happens to public space when a country is at war? So this specific project, which I would like to share today, looks at Ukraine's cities through that question, specifically at what we call the linguistic landscape, the language of public science. So since the full-scale Russian invasion, spaces have changed dramatically. Across Ukrainian cities, we now see posters, murals, banners, shop slogans, even pizza menus that are doing much more than simply informing or advertising. They're speaking. They're expressing belonging, resistance, grief, defiance. They show how people respond to war, not only politically, but emotionally and socially. They help communicate, cope, protest, and inspire. So my study is based on a corpus of such signs or texts collected from multiple cities in Ukraine, and I approach them not just as texts, but as public interventions, acts that both reflect and shape social meaning. And I focus on one key idea, activism in and through language. So on the one hand, language itself becomes a political act. On the other, language becomes a tool, a medium for expressing resistance, solidarity, and hope. Together, these perspectives show how language transforms my apologies. Language transforms public space during wartime, not just materially, but symbolically, as a way of resisting violence and asserting belonging. So let me very briefly situate the theoretical lens that guides this work. So early linguistic landscape research, such as Landry and Bourguet, focused primarily on the visibility and distribution of languages in public space, which means which languages appear, where, and in what proportion. My approach builds on more recent scholarship that moves beyond counting languages and instead asks, what do these signs do? So in this sense, I treat the linguistic landscape not simply as a collection of texts, but as a semiotic and ethnographic space, a space where meaning is produced, negotiated, and contested. So drawing on Bloomer's work, I understand the linguistic landscape as full of traces of human activity, interactions, relations, histories, and anticipated futures. So in other words, every sign carries a layer of meaning. It does not simply reflect language use, it points to broader social relations, to histories, and to imagined futures. At the same time, I draw on Skolin and Skolin's concept of indexicality, the idea that signs point beyond themselves. They index who is speaking, to whom, in what context, and with what intention. So signs are never neutral. They position both their producers and within wider social and political discourses. And this becomes especially important in wartime context, where every linguistic choice can carry heightened ideological weight. So building on this understanding of the linguistic landscape, I approach activism as something that becomes visible through these semiotic practices. In wartime Ukraine, activism is not limited to organized movements or formal political action. It is embedded in everyday public expression, and language is one of its most powerful vehicles. So here I distinguish between two closely connected dimensions. First, language activism. So this refers to acts of reclaiming, promoting, or resisting particular languages, language policies, or language practices. In the Ukrainian context, this is especially visible in the bottom-up expressions where individuals and communities actively promote Ukrainian, reject to a certain extent Russian, and reconstruct both collective and personal identities through language, choice, and visibility in public space. But activism does not operate only at the level of which language is used. It also operates through how languages is used. So what I refer to as activism via language. This shifts our attention to tone, slogans, symbols, humor, emotion, to the meanings that animate these signs as communicative acts. Language here becomes a tool of emotional and ideological force. It can convey grief, express defiance, create solidarity, or assert national pride. So we are looking not just at language as a system, but at language as action. So taken together, these two dimensions, language activism and activism via language, allow us to see public signs in Ukraine as more than responses to war. So they are acts of resistance and at the same time, acts of community and nation building, ways of asserting agency in the midst of ongoing violence. So let me very briefly explain how this study was conducted. So I approached Ukrainian linguistic landscape not simply as a collection of signs, but as a reflection of how people communicate, respond, and make meaning during war. So the study is based on a corpus of 104 visual and verbal examples collected between 2024 and early 25 from sources such as Facebook, Instagram, news sites, blogs, online stores, and Google searches. So materials range from billboards, murals, and public posters to more everyday items like stickers, t-shirts, grocery labels, menus, and even bank cards. So importantly, the data set includes both official messages produced by institutions or campaigns and grassroots expressions created by ordinary people, business people, and local communities. So what interested me most was not only what these signs say, but how language is used publicly to express resistance, identity, resilience, humor, and belonging during wartime. So let me also briefly say a few words about how I approached my analysis. I looked at each linguistic landscape text mainly as a verbal message, also paying attention to visual elements and how they reinforce meaning. The data were then grouped into broader thematic clusters around two main ideas: language activism, where language itself becomes the focus of action, and activism via language, where language is used to communicate resistance, solidarity, humor, hope, and defiance. Together, these clusters help show how in wartime Ukraine language becomes both the message and the means of civic and ideological engagement. So let me now turn to language activism, which emerges as one of the most prominent and visible themes in Ukraine's linguistic landscape, and one that is deeply rooted, historically layered, and politically charged. At the same time, it is important to emphasize that the kinds of messages I analyzed in this study did not suddenly appear in 2022. While my focus on linguistic landscape texts that have emerged following the full-scale invasion, these forms of expression have a long trajectory. In fact, similar texts began to appear with increasing visibility after 2014, following Russia's annexation of Crimea and the onset of military aggression in eastern Ukraine. So that earlier period marks an important shift when language became when language began to take on a more explicitly public and political role in everyday space. As scholars have shown, this was a moment when language activism became increasingly visible in public discourse, when particular language ideologies began to crystallize. So specifically, Ukrainian came to be more strongly associated with sovereignty, resistance, and national identity. So what we see after 2022 then is not an entirely new phenomenon, but rather an intensification, an expansion of these earlier processes, as language becomes even more central to how individuals and communities respond to war. So this becomes particularly visible when we turn to the data. In the linguistic landscape text collected for this study, we see strong and often very direct grassroots advocacy for Ukrainian as the rightful national language. So these are not abstract or subtle messages. They're explicit, visible, and addressed to the public. So for example, as we see here, we encounter slogans such as, "Why not in Ukrainian? Don't talk to me about freedom in the language of slavery." So this slogan, a slogan of the movement that began in August 2022. Common as well are slogans that simply feature the distinctive Ukrainian letter Y, functioning as powerful micro acts of activism. Even in isolation, this letter carries strong symbolic meaning. It is immensely recognizable as uniquely Ukrainian, and its presence alone can signal identity, distinction, and linguistic belonging. So here, language activism operates at a very minimal but highly visible semiotic level. So these linguistic landscape texts not only highlight the presence of Ukrainian, but also invite, often urge, Russian-speaking Ukrainians to switch languages. So such calls, not new, but again common since early 2000s and 2014. In fact, this movement of urging Ukrainians to switch to their language practices from Russian into Ukrainian began in 2007 on an initiative of the NGO "Не будь байдужим," don't be apathetic. So another example here, Happy Ukrainian Literacy, a language day, reinforces the call towards Ukrainian language practices, displaying appreciation for knowledge of Ukrainian. So these calls for a shift are framed not simply as a matter of linguistic preference, but as a civic responsibility, a symbolic break with imperial legacies, and importantly, as an act of decolonization. So other examples, such as the slogans "language is your weapon," continue to circulate widely and remain highly relevant. So here, language is explicitly framed as a form of agency, as something that can be mobilized in the context of war, not physically, but symbolically and ideologically. Or we encounter more affirming and forward-looking messages, such as when there is language, there are Ukrainians, there is the state, therefore there is future. So this type of statement draws a direct connection between language, people, statehood, and futurity, positioning language as foundational to national continuity. So in short, all of these linguistic landscape texts further elevate Ukrainian as a language of resistance, of creativity, and national pride. So this form of language activism is visible in top-down initiatives, as in some of the examples we've seen, but it is predominantly bottom-up. It is not always directly by state policy. Rather, it is performed by individuals and communities in everyday spaces, on stickers, posters, T-shirts, billboards. Through these texts, language becomes a claim to identity, a call for unity, and a reaffirmation of what it means to be Ukrainian linguistically, culturally, nationally, and increasingly globally. So let me turn to activism via language. That is how language is used as a tool to communicate resistance, identity, and emotional strength, among other sub-themes in the context of war. A key aspect here is the power of language choice. Since the full-scale invasion, language in public space has become not just a means of expression, but a conscious act of positioning. In the linguistic landscape, this is not simply about the presence of Ukrainian or Russian, the two historically prominent languages in Ukraine, but about who is being addressed and why. So while Ukrainian legislation, such as the 2019 law on the functioning of Ukrainian as the state language, laid important groundwork for increasing the visibility of Ukrainian, in practice, public spaces continued to include both Ukrainian and Russian. However, the wartime linguistic landscape tells us a slightly different story, a story of transformation. So language boundaries have become more defined, more intentional, and more ideologically charged. So what emerges from the data is also a pattern of address. So Ukrainian is used predominantly to speak to Ukrainians, to affirm unity, express solidarity, and foster and secure national consciousness, and to talk about the enemy. So this is evident both at the national level and locally, particularly in occupied and frontline territories, where the very visibility of Ukrainian becomes itself a form of resistance. Russian, in contrast, appear not exclusively, but mostly in messages directed towards the enemy. These messages are often laced with sarcasm, threat, or contempt, transforming the language of the aggressor not only into a vehicle for delivering a message, but into a rhetorical weapon. So occasionally Russian does appear in other contexts, such as private business signage, yet even there it is accompanied by a visible push towards replacing Russian with Ukrainian. So these shifts underscore that language choice is no longer incidental. It is strategic, symbolic, and political. English is also present in the linguistic landscape. While it is not my focus today, it is worth noting briefly that in linguistic landscape, English is often used to address the international community. So along language choice, the content of linguistic landscape messages become equally significant. Public signs begin to function as platforms of communication with very specific audiences: the Ukrainian public, local communities, and the invading forces. So these messages are not simply informative, they're performative. They rally, console, resist, and provoke. So the question becomes, how are different audiences constructed through language in public space? So to explore this, I will first look at texts that appear to address Ukrainians themselves, what is called in literature as in-group audience. I will then turn to another set of signs where both the addressee and the tone shift quite noticeably. So what we begin to see through these examples is that language in wartime Ukraine is not only descriptive, it is performative. It acts, it positions, and it shapes how the word itself is experienced and understood. So let me now turn to the first major theme that emerges from the data: national identity and belonging. So in these texts, primarily targeting Ukrainian audiences, activism via language is not only about resisting the enemy, it is about affirming who we are. Across Ukraine, we see signs that use language to assert identity, build unity, and to reinforce a collective sense of purpose. And importantly, these are not abstract ideas. They are made visible and tangible in everyday spaces, on street signs, packaging, murals, clothing, chocolates, and cookies, as we see here, for instance, with messages such as glory to heroes, together towards victory. We don't want what's yours, but we want to give up what's ours. I love Ukraine, pray for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine. So the messages addressing Ukrainian audiences consistently emphasize solidarity, perseverance, and belonging. So simple but powerful phrases such as Ukraine is united, together we are strong, or even what's cooler than a family of 44 million, work to reaffirm a national community under threat. We see examples like these across different contexts. And what is important here is that these signs do not simply inform. Again, as I mentioned earlier, they perform unity, they perform hope, and they perform strength in public space. Linguistic choices in these signs are often paired with strong semiotic symbols. So we see, for instance, the use of the letter Y, which we already discussed earlier, as well as national colors and visual markers of identity. We also encounter more complex forms of cultural revoicing, such as poetic rewritings or patriotic adaptations of canonical texts by Shevchenko and Ukrainka. In some cases, these figures are even depicted in military attire, while the altered texts retain the poetic form but speak directly to contemporary wartime realities. So here, cultural heritage is not only preserved, it is reinterpreted and mobilized in the present moment. So these elements create a strong sense of emotional resonance and cultural depth. Even ordinary items, notebooks, t-shirts, again, chocolate wrappers, or grocery labels become platforms for patriotic affirmation. On grocery labels, for example, we see salads titled Glory to Ukraine, another labeled Vyshyvanka, that is embroidery, and even one called Death to the Enemy. There are chicken wings named Mria, meaning dream or hope, referencing the destroyed Ukrainian aircraft, once the largest plane in the world. We also see Perishke, called Our Strength, and a baguette labeled Independence. So importantly, these signs are not always overtly political. Some are humorous, others poetic, but what connects them in their unmistakable role in sustaining national spirit. In wartime, this becomes a powerful form of activism, language that quite literally holds a community, a nation together. So alongside messages of unity and belonging, a second key pattern that emerges from the data is the language of emotional strength. These signs communicate resilience not only as a political stance, but as a deeply personal and collective emotional position. The war has generated immense trauma and uncertainty, and yet across Ukraine, public texts use language to resist despair. We encounter motivational slogans such as "we will never be defeated," "victory is ours," or simply "unbreakable," as in these examples. Messages like these are not just words and not only colors and images. They function as daily affirmations, visible, repeatable reminders of courage and hope. So here are other examples, including those appearing on bank cards. Bravery, good evening, we are from Ukraine, and Ukraine in its entirety is my comfort zone. Even highly routine objects like these bank cards become carriers of emotional and symbolic meaning. In frontline towns, in occupied areas, and in cities under constant threat, linguistic landscape texts take on an even more immediate function. They serve to bolster morale, they reassure, encourage, and help sustain communities under stress. So here are some examples, including one of many signs produced by an elderly man, Petro Chorny in Vinnytsia, displayed on a soccer field. And this text reads, "Glory to our armed forces and to the free people, for the Cossack lineage has no end. Our boys, true Cossacks, are the pride of Ukraine. May prayer always shield you from the bullets, and may God protect you in time of trouble." So in cases like this, we see how individual initiatives become part of a broader public voice. In this sense, language becomes a form of psychological defense, a way of holding grounds when everything feels unstable and uncertain. We also see many of these texts, many future-oriented languages, in some of the previous examples. As in some of the previous examples and these ones as well. Rather than dwelling on fear and grief, many linguistic landscape items look ahead, invoking the idea of victorious, free, and rebuilt Ukraine. So here we have Ukraine will prevail, or you can destroy the plane, but you can never destroy the Mriya, dream. So this kind of linguistic futurity gives people a reason to endure. So at the same time, it is important to note the emotional range of these texts. Some are urgent and defiant, others are gentle, even intimate, addressing neighbors, children, or Ukrainian soldiers with care and pride. So together they form a kind of collective emotional register, one that sustains public life through language during war. So let's now turn to the third theme, messages of psychological resistance aimed at enemy. So in addition to messages of unity and emotional resilience directed towards Ukrainians, the third theme centers on messages directed towards the enemy, a distinctly different kind of linguistic strategy. So here language becomes a tool of psychological resistance. These signs do not appeal to hope or solidarity. They confront. Often they use sharp, deliberate messaging to undermine, mock, or reject the invading forces, as seen in these examples. Hey, invader, your friends are below in bags, or good orc is a dead orc. And of course, the visual dimension here is equally important. So in this layer of linguistic landscape, the enemy is stripped of legitimacy, dignity, and symbolic power. So here we see, for instance, a Ukrainian woman portrayed in a position of strength and authority, distancing herself from the Russian Krasavitsa, or the board, diminishing Russia's power. Kyiv Christianized Moscow, and Kyiv will be wanting Moscow. So many trying to adopt a tone of ridicule. Russian soldiers are portrayed not as terrifying, but as absurd. As in these examples, we also encounter derogatory terms such as Rusnya and Moskal nekrasivy. Humorous labels, vulgar phrases, or ironic slogans are used to belittle the aggressor. So on this slide here, we see in the center of the image, we see a threatening message framed through a humorous children's counting out rhyme, which creates a striking contrast between form and content. So here, in the example on the left, we see a juxtaposition. The phrase "good luck" appears in Ukrainian and English, while the Russian version is rendered through obscene language. A similar form of obscene resistance is visible on the bank cards shown here. And in the third example, a billboard featuring a modified poem by Shevchenko, revoiced to address the enemy directly through vulgar language. There are also signs that emphasize moral distance. They construct a clear boundary between us and them. As in this advertisement, comparing the Ukrainian military to the Russian forces. So here we have our guys in the armed forces of Ukraine are like coffee, strong and hot. The orcs, they're like tea, either loose leaf or in bags. Or in this example, where Russian becomes explicitly the language of the enemy, used intentionally to target, confront, ridicule, or shame. So unlike earlier periods when Russian might have appeared more neutrally in public space, its use here often signals hostility, a form of weaponized language directed at the invaders. So this kind of linguistic practice is powerful. It allows the population to reclaim agency, not only through defiance, but also through humor, mockery, and controlled aggression. So these are not merely cathartic responses, they're semiotic acts of resistance, carving out a public space where Ukrainians refuse to be silent or submissive. So with these three themes, belonging, emotional resilience, and psychological resistance, we see clearly how language is not just observed, but mobilized. It becomes an active force within the linguistic and socio-political landscape of war. So as my analysis demonstrates, public discourses on and via language in wartime Ukraine are not only visible, they're deeply pronounced and pervasive. Linguistic landscape texts, whether top-down or bottom-up, offer compelling evidence of how Ukrainians are actively responding to the ongoing invasion and to how language plays a central and dynamic role in that response. While the examples discussed here represent only a small fraction of the broader public discourse, they provide a valuable window into the lived linguistic experience of Ukrainians during war. They allow us to trace how messages in public space reflect what is on the minds of ordinary people, how language is being used both as a subject of reflection and as a medium of action. So the individuals and groups behind these texts, whether through grassroots signage, commercial packaging, or official billboards, can be understood as agents of language activism. Their engagement reflects deeply held language ideologies, which surface through visible semiotic acts of resistance and affirmation. What we observe overall is a strong self-empowerment through language. Empowering Ukrainian as a language in its own right, one that is used not only to communicate, but to galvanize, inspire, and unify. Empowering Ukrainians themselves through messages of national unity, resilience, and shared strength. Equally important is the use of language to distance and alienate the enemy through satire, insult, mockery, or simply by positioning Russian as a language suitable only for addressing the invader. So in this way, the conscious drawing of language boundaries marks not only difference, but also defines. And finally, we can view linguistic landscape tags during wartime as coping mechanisms, as ways to express grief, hope, anger, and belonging in a time of profound uncertainty. These are not just communicative acts, they are social performances of identity, community, and endurance. And to conclude, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine has catalyzed a profound transformation in the public semiotic space. Through text, large and small, murals, posters, slogans, packaging, stamps, grocery items, menus, and many others, Ukrainians are asserting not only political resistance, but also linguistic and cultural sovereignty. What we witness then is a war fought not only with weapons, but with words. Words that empower the in-group, words that confront the aggressor, and words that fortify collective identity and resilience. So this study shows that language in wartime Ukraine is not incidental or passive. It is a site of struggle, a tool of resistance, and a resource for healing. So in short, linguistic landscape texts reveal the deeply ideological, emotional, and symbolic functions of language in moments of war. They are quite literally the voice of a nation under attack, but not silent. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Already, this is amazing. I can talk a lot and comment a lot, but let me give microphone to Dr. Deutsch, our former graduate dean. And Dr. Deutsch, you please open your microphone. Yes.
Yeah. What is your sense of the shift in the use of language within Ukraine? That is, what percentage of the people, the everyday person, use Russian prior to the war, and what percentage now use Ukraine either exclusively or primarily? Do you have any sense of that?
Well, there have been a few studies that document this, and particularly I would refer you to studies by Volodymyr Kulik, who has done quite a lot of work in this respect. And in terms of his statistics, there are clearly shifts in terms of language practices of Ukrainians. So I don't have it right in front of me, but I would definitely be able to share with specific statistics. With respect to respond shortly, there have been clearly shifts in terms of language practices of Ukrainians.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any more comments or questions? Katerina, please.
Hello, thank you for an amazing presentation. I'm sorry for joining the conversation late, but I will rewatch the first half. Just a comment to follow up on Dean Deutsch's question and your answer. My son is studying in London right now, and one of his roommates is from Ukraine, and it's the same age. They're probably both like 20 years old. And my son is learning Ukrainian, has been learning Ukrainian all his life. We're from an immigrant family. His classmate only speaks Russian. He's from Ukraine, but has not spoken Russian since the war started or shortly thereafter. And so just a small little example, anecdote, I have a young kid. He now speaks English. That's it's his only language of communication. So just look, a small little detail to add to there. But I want to go back to your presentation. there was a German philosopher in the 1800s, Jürgen Habermas, who talked about the public sphere, and he talked about the power of communication in the public sphere. And your presentation is just probably the best example I've ever seen of this, the communication that anyone can participate in, can put out, can receive and understand. I'm very, very grateful to you for finding all of these examples and the wide range. As you said, some are with humor, some are very emotional. I love the ones that take Taras Shevchenko's poetry, you know, Yaku Mruto Pochowajcie. Now it's like, when we kill you, we're going to bury you. And so some pretty amazing and very clever expressions of how Ukraine is united. So no question, just a genuine heartfelt thank you for, I'm scrolling here through the presentation slides, and absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this. I guess if I have a question, there's one where it's a long message, and it says on the roof, "Glory to our armed forces and to the free people." It looks like it's on a rooftop with somebody with snow shoveling it out. Is that right? If you can go back to that.
Yes, I'll show that. It's on a soccer field.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
So let me share. It's on a soccer field. It's an elderly gentleman in Vinnytsia who is just producing these. That's the one, right?
There we go. There we go. Oh my goodness. Yeah. I missed that at first. I saw the cars, but I didn't understand the perspective. That is absolutely brilliant. So does he do this regularly, or is this just a one-time thing, or?
Yes, he does this. I'm not sure whether he continues now, but at the time of my data collection, he was doing these, and there are quite a few of these signs. So he made into the news because of these messages that he was producing on a regular basis. Yes.
And this is such a great example of the whole public sphere communication. The public sphere, this costs nothing. Anybody can do this. I guess if you have access to the soccer field, it's very moving. It's very moving and very beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing all this information with us. This is truly exciting and highly valuable. Thank you.
Thank you so much for such warm comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Schrey and Dr. Deutsch are English professors by training, and I'm just an amateur, but I lived through the Soviet Union and all these years and decades. My question is comparative for the Americans who would not know the details, but as we see the Soviet legacy crumbling, one needs to understand that it's much easier for people in Georgia or Armenia or Uzbekistan to drop Russian language as the first or second one than it was in Ukraine, probably because colonization and Russification was much deeper. I lived in Turkmenistan for years. Women in rural villages did not understand Russian at all. At the same time, we understand that from outside, this split is, this chasm is closing, is not closing, it's expressing itself very rapidly. So my question is, next generation children, as far as I know, Russian is not taught in public schools in Ukraine since war started. So we can see in a few years, children of this war, they definitely by all means will not speak Russian. Is this correct?
Well, I wouldn't want to be the one making predictions, but what we witness is developing into that direction. I myself also studied the language attitudes and also language practices in immigrant communities. So, which relates to previous comment as well. A lot of, even though perhaps parents do not switch, or maybe grandparents do not switch themselves, but that sort of language transformations are happening via children. So let's say in immigrant community, what I see is they're often that parents here in Alberta, in Canada, parents would continue to speak Russian with each other. However, they would speak Ukrainian to the children, or they would enroll Ukrainian in Ukrainian bilingual program, Ukrainian heritage schools, Ukrainian theater, and so on. So that is true. So that shift is happening, especially by children. And
Sure.
most likely in Ukraine as well. Although, again, the situation is quite complex, right? I mean, if we look at the occupied territories, the horrible Russification and propaganda and what is happening. But again, scholars have discussed this, and there are wonderful articles by Pitkuimucha on this about the language erasure in the occupied territories and so on. So the processes are quite complex, but at the same time, very, very visible. Very visible shifts and transformations are taking place. And of course, we cannot generalize, because for different people, it happens at different speeds or at different configurations.
Thank you.
And just to kind of look at the other side of it, it just makes me so. Again, I joined this late, but did you grow up in Canada? Or did you grow up in Ukraine and come to Canada?
I grew up in Ukraine,
See,
but I have been living in Canada for over 27 or so years, and I lived in the States as well. So I came to the United States in 91.
So I grew up here in a Ukrainian immigrant community, and there's plenty of that. New York, Chicago, Detroit. I grew up in Philadelphia. We have Ukrainian school, you have Ukrainian cerkva, churches, stores, Volosky dance ensemble. I mean, there's an entire thriving culture. And Plast scouts, Sum scouts. Again and again, I know I've said this before in this program, but I am very grateful to our parents for raising us in Ukrainian, going to Ukrainian school every Saturday. Who wants to do that? You're going to school Monday through Friday, and your friends are all sleeping in watching cartoons on Saturday. You're going to Ukrainian school. Also, our parents' insistence on speaking Ukrainian. There was a lot of, po-ukrainski, like to remind us of it. And as a child, you don't always fully appreciate that, what they were doing, but they were doing it exactly for this moment, because not only is my generation, and hopefully our children to some extent, able to participate in reading those signs, those things that you shared, when we're included in those funny jokes or in those undertones or in those moving expressions, we can read that, we understand that, but hopefully that's also kind of works backwards. And for the people of Ukraine, knowing that there is 1 million of us, literally, it's like a little bit over 1 million people of Ukrainian descent, like me, in the United States, who speak Ukrainian, maybe immigrant Ukrainian. At this point, I think Ukrainian must have changed since our parents came over in the 1950s, 1960s. But if anything, it's probably a purer form. It would be from the western part of Ukraine, Ternopil, Lviv, where a lot of the immigrants came from. But in any case, it's this unification of language. I love how it extends beyond the borders of Ukraine to include the entire diaspora, anybody with Ukrainian heritage. And just a huge credit to the generation that came before us, who had the wisdom and foresight to preserve that language, and it gave us this access to a culture that is very, very beautiful and now in very great danger. So I just thank you again for your presentation.
For your comment, yes. I did receive a thank you from my own teenage daughters just probably a month ago. So thank you for raising us, in Ukrainian. So that was a very touching moment for me as a parent as well.
Oh, I bet, yeah.
Thank you both, and this is very beautiful comments, Katerina. Thank you. We have heard many of these stories on our program unfortunately, over 4 years, and we cannot stop admiring the strengths and beauty of what people are doing and preserving. If we have no more questions, we are closing our program, and if before Katerina says a few words in Ukrainian to our audience, maybe our speaker wants to add something more.
No, I'm very happy to be part of this series. As I said, it's a great
Thank you.
honor to be part of this conversation, which is very important.
Thank you very much for all that you are doing, for your work, and we are very glad to have you. Hope we will have you here again. Katerina, please.
Дорогі браття і сестри в Україні, ви є незламні. Ми зберігаємо вас у наших щоденних думках і молитвах. Нехай милосердний Бог тримає вас у своїй опіці. До наступного тижня прощаємося.
Слава Україні!
Героям слава!